In this video, I'm going to focus on working the standard wrap and turn short row method on a garter stitch piece of fabric. I'm going to show you a method that includes using stitch markers as indicators, but also the method of simply looking for the gap. The term short row simply means that you're not going to complete an entire row when you're knitting. For example, what we're going to do is work 2 stitch short rows, which means I'm going to start at the very end here, knit all the way to the last 2 stitches, and then I'm going to turn and come back and work 2 stitches short, turn my work again and work 2 stitches short of where I turned last time. And we're going to work back and forth, creating some shaping using short rows. So just if you want to follow along, I have cast on 36 stitches and I have knit a few rows of garter stitch. It's not really important for the terms of practicing, but some people really like to know those details. So I'm going to start knitting in garter stitch, and I'm going to knit to a few stitches before the end of my row, and then I'm going to come back and show you how I like to work my wrap and turn in garter stitch. Okay, so I have knit to 5 stitches before the end of the row. My instructions say to knit to 3, so I'm going to knit these final 2 stitches, and now I'm going to work my wrap and turn because the instructions say to knit to 3 stitches before the end of the row, wrap and turn. So to perform the wrap and turn, how I like to do it, and some people's instructions will vary, is I like to move the working yarn to the front between the left hand and right hand needles, and then slip that next stitch purlwise. Now, if you're going to use a stitch marker as an indicator, this is where you want to place it on your left hand needle. That's going to be your indicator of your turning point. The next step is to move the working yarn back between the needles so that you create a wrap around that stitch that you had previously slipped. You'll see in garter stitch you have a lower bump and an upper bump, and that upper bump is the wrap that you created. Next, we're going to slip the stitch purlwise back to the left hand needle, and that is the wrap portion of a wrap and turn completed. Now we're going to turn the work. And to complete this for garter stitch, because our working yarn needs to be in the back to knit, we're going to move it between the needles one more time, completing that wrap. So you'll see that you've got a wrap around that stitch. Your marker is in place, and there's 2 stitches to the left or to the right of it. So now I'm going to knit back to the other end and show you how to do a wrap and turn without placing a marker. It's very simple, but I want you to see the difference when you're working. Okay, so I've knit back to the other end of the row, and I am 3 stitches before the end. To work the wrap and turn, we're going to move the working yarn between the needles to the front, slip the stitch from the left hand to the right hand purlwise, wrap the stitch by moving the working yarn between the needles again, return the stitch purlwise from the right hand to the left hand needle, which completes our wrap. We've got our double stitch or our double bar. We're going to turn our work again. And because we need to knit back the other way, we're going to move the working yarn one more time between the needles and start knitting. So in this case, I did not place a marker. That's because visually you can see that there's a fairly distinct gap between these 2 stitches and where we wrapped our stitch and turned to work back. Some people have an easier time viewing this than others, but it's no different than having a marker. So I'm going to work back to the next end and do another wrap and turn and explain to you what the nomenclature is about counting stitches before performing your next turn. My instructions say to knit to 3 stitches before the gap or 3 stitches before the turning point and then wrap and turn. So this marker is simply indicating the gap. So I now have to perform a wrap and turn. That's going to leave 2 stitches between the markers. One more time to work the wrap, we move our working yarn to the front, slip the stitch, move the working yarn to the back so you have your wrap, And if you're going to use markers, this is the place to do it. Put it on your left-hand needle. We're going to transfer our stitch purlwise. I know I've sped up, but you guys have seen this a few times already. We've performed our wrap. Now we're going to turn, move our working yarn between the stitches one more time, and continue knitting back. So what I'm going to do now is, actually while you're here, I'm just going to keep knitting across this row and get to the point where I need to knit 3 stitches. And once I've showed you that final wrap and turn, I'm going to work the wrap and turn on each end 3 more times so that I'll be able to lay this flat so you can see what the gaps look like versus what the markers look like. My instructions once again say to knit to 3 stitches before the previous turning point or 3 stitches before the gap. I look at my work and I've got 2 stitches here, and to me this is a very clear gap. So I have 4 stitches, so I have to knit 1 more and perform my wrap and turn. So working yarn to the front, slip, wrap, slip, turn, wrap, and continue knitting. So I'm going to set this down so you can see I now have 2 what I think of as fairly distinct gaps where I have worked my wrap and turn. I'm going to continue doing this so that you end up with 5 markers on this side and 5 gaps on this side, and then we'll talk about how to finish up working your short rows in garter stitch. So I am back to work my final wrap and turn on the side with no markers. There's my wrap and my turn. And we'll move that to the back. So now if we look at our work laid out, we have got 1, 2, 3, 4, and we've just created the 5th gap on this side where we've worked short rows. And on this side, we've got our markers indicating our short rows, but you can see that the gaps are there and relatively prominent. I think a lot of preference has to do with your tension and the size of the yarn that you're working on. I'm currently using bulky weight on a 10, so I think the gaps are more pronounced. But now what we need to do is go back and finish picking up all of our stitches so that we are back to working even rather than working short rows. So my working yarn is in position to knit across the project. So we are simply going to knit across to the first marker. Now if this was worked in stockinette, you would need to pick up the wrap with the stitch that was wrapped and knit the 2 together like a K2 tog. The beauty of garter stitch with wrap and turns is it really hides the wrap. So there's no need to pick up the wrap, which is where I'm at. I'm at the marker, so the stitch before it has got a wrap. Normally you would have to pick this up, place it on your needle, and knit the 2 stitches together. But because garter stitch is so squishy, it hides it. So you can actually just knit that wrapped stitch and remove the marker. Your next stitch is not wrapped, but the stitch before the marker is. You can see that extra wrap right here above your bump. You can just knit it and remove your marker. Whoops, I'll find that later. So we're going to continue that to the end of the row, just simply knitting the wrapped stitch rather than picking it up and removing our markers. We did a 2-stitch wrap and turn, which means that between each wrap and turn there are 2 stitches. That's a pretty steep wrap and turn ratio. If you wanted to have a shallower short row, you would simply work more stitches between your turns. So you can see the gaps are gone, and now we're going to turn our work and knit back as if to knit even. So when we get to our gaps, because we don't need to knit or pick up the wrap, we can simply knit to the end of this row. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to knit to the end, and then I'm going to lay it flat and show you what it looks like when it's all done in Garter. So I have picked up and knit, or rather just knit past all of my short rows. You can see there's a small distortion in the stitches here, and that's where the new row meets the end of the old row where we wrapped and turned our stitches. It is definitely less prominent in smaller yarns on smaller needles. As I said, this was a bulky yarn on a larger needle. But it's a great way to add shaping to your stitches or your project without actually having to increase or decrease stitches. So I hope that you've enjoyed learning how to wrap and turn in Garter stitch. Practice along, have some fun. Definitely try putting more stitches between your turns to see what the angle of shaping changes like. This is, as I say, this was just 2 stitches, so it's a little bit of a steeper shape. But yeah, have fun with it, enjoy your short rows, and happy knitting.